Welcome to the new session of the Research Seminars series hosted by Nomadic Labs. Today's speakers are Vincent Botbol and Eugen Zalinescu. Vincent Botbol is an R&D architect at Nomadic Labs, and Eugen Zalinescu is a research engineer at Nomadic Labs working in the consensus team. They are here to talk about Tenderbake, bringing deterministic finality to Tezos. In this talk, Vincent and Eugen will present the so-called classic BFT consensus algorithm and its integration in Tezos. Feel free to ask your questions directly in the chat. A Q&A will happen at the end of the presentations. So let's start.
Hello everybody, thank you for attending this session on Tenderbake. This presentation will be divided into two parts. In the first part, I will give a quick background on consensus and on Emmy, the current consensus algorithm in Tezos. And then I'll present Tenderbake at a rather abstract level, only marginally touching on how it integrates with Tezos. Vincent will then take over and present this aspect in more detail, highlighting the changes that users will observe if Tenderbake is adopted. So let's start with some background on consensus. A consensus algorithm is a fundamental building block of a blockchain protocol. It is the mechanism used to ensure that each participating party agrees on the same sequence of blocks and therefore on the same blockchain state. We usually require that a consensus protocol for blockchains has two main properties. The first one, agreement, also known as consistency or finality, is a safety property. It requires that any two parties agree on their chains, or at least on a large prefix of their chains. Said otherwise, there should be no forks, or at least no long forks. The second main property, progress, is a liveness property. It requires that the chain of each party grows with time. And these two properties should hold even when the players do not follow the algorithm, either because of benign failures like crashes, or because players are Byzantine, that is, they act maliciously in order to break consensus. Furthermore, the network over which players communicate may experience problems like long message delays or even splits into several partitions for a while. Let me now fix some terminology regarding the finality property. We say that a block or a transaction is final if, once it is on a party's chain, it remains on that party's chain, and that for each party. Furthermore, when considering a particular block or transaction, by confirmations, we refer to the consecutive blocks that have been added on top of a considered one. And we usually distinguish two kinds of finality. Under deterministic finality, after constant number of confirmations, a block is for sure final. This constant is usually very small, and when it is zero, we talk about immediate finality. Under probabilistic finality, after a number n of confirmations, a block is final with some probability that depends on n. Usually, this probability increases exponentially with the number of confirmations, meaning that after a sufficiently many number of confirmations, depending on the consensus algorithm and on its assumptions, we are virtually sure that the block is final. Let me now talk about two main classes of consensus algorithms. These do not cover all consensus algorithms out there, but they represent a very large part. We have, on the one hand, what I call the Nakamoto-style algorithms, like Bitcoin and its variants, be them based on proof of work or proof of stake. Conceptually, they are quite simple. There are basically just two rules. Block producers are selected at random, and on average, a party is a block producer proportionally to its ownership of some bounded resource, like mining power or stake. There can be forks, and whenever a party notices one, the fork is resolved in the favor of the heaviest chain, where the notion of weight is directly or indirectly defined in terms of a bounded resource I mentioned. Under the assumption that an attacker does not own more than half of the resources, then it cannot produce long forks. And this is because in the long run, the length of this chain is proportional to the resources it owns, and therefore its chain will be shorter than the honest chain. A last important characteristic of Nakamoto-style algorithms is that they assume that the network is synchronous, meaning that there is an upper bound on the message delays. On how much time does it take for a message to be propagated? And this upper bound is related to the time between blocks. The smaller this time, the smaller the upper bound needs to be. And if message delays are actually higher than the upper bound, then the probability of fork increases. And in the worst case, when the network is split into two partitions, there will be forks for as long as the network is split. I call the other class of consensus algorithms for blockchain classic style algorithms because they are inspired from Byzantine fault-tolerant consensus algorithms like PBFT, designed starting from the late 70s. Such algorithms are usually much more involved. However, they all use one simple but important property, the so-called quorum intersection property. And this explains why they only tolerate up to 1/3 of Byzantine participants. So let me briefly try to explain it. For simplicity, assume that there are n parties, n equals 3f plus 1, where f is the number of Byzantine parties. We call a quorum any set of 2f plus 1 parties, that is, a set with at least 2/3 plus 1 of the total parties. The quorum intersection property says that any two sets of 2f plus 1 parties intersect in at least f plus 1 parties, and that's an instance of a pigeonhole principle, and therefore in at least one honest party. And you can see an illustration in case n equals 4 and f equals 1 in the figure. So how is this property used by a consensus algorithm? For instance, say that to take a decision, we require that each party casts exactly one vote, and we have to gather a quorum of votes. Then, if we do observe such a quorum, then we know that everybody has taken the same decision. And this is because if there would be a quorum on a different decision, then by the quorum intersection property, the two quorums intersect in at least one honest party, who therefore voted on two different decisions. And that's impossible because the rule said that each honest party only casts one vote. So the takeaway here is that the quorum intersection property is used to ensure that this class of algorithms satisfies deterministic finality. If a block is considered final, then it really is final. Finally, in contrast to Nakamoto-style algorithm, classic-style algorithms do not require synchrony for safety. They only require synchrony to ensure that new blocks are finalized. So here is a summary of the main differences between the two classes of algorithms I have mentioned. So before going on to Tenderbake, let me briefly summarize the current consensus algorithm in Tezos, nicknamed Emmy. Its first version was presented in the Tezos white paper in 2014. So as you all know, it's a Nakamoto-style stake-based algorithm, and it was one of the first of its kind. Its main strength is probably the use of endorsements to reduce the number of confirmations and to better prevent against selfish baking. Emmy has seen a number of improvements over the last years with respect to its initial version. In the Babylon Protocol amendment, its design was made more robust and consistent, further improving the protection against selfish baking. In Carthage, the incentive scheme was improved to better protect against deflationary baking. And finally, the last adjustment in Granada increased the number of endorsing slots, thus further decreasing the confirmation numbers. And it also decreased the block times from 1 minute to 30 seconds in case the chain is healthy. That is, when a large majority of endorsements is included in blocks. These changes ensure that, assuming the network and the chains are healthy and requiring that the probability of a fork is less than once in a century, the minimum number of confirmations is very small, only 2 confirmations required for attacker stakes of up to 33%. Nevertheless, as I mentioned in the previous slide, moving to a classic style algorithm that ensures safety even when the network is asynchronous and that furthermore offers the convenience of having deterministic finality, it is very attractive. So that's why we have Tenderbake. Tenderbake is a variant of Tendermint, which itself is probably the first adaptation of a classic style algorithm for blockchain. The algorithm was designed for a collaboration between Nomadic Labs and the Liszt Institute of the French Center for Atomic Energy. It was presented this year at the Foundations and Applications of Blockchain Symposium, and the corresponding technical report can be found on our site. Before going on and presenting the algorithm, let me emphasize that it is not a strict improvement over Emmy. As I have already mentioned, there are trade-offs. Also, regarding the Byzantine stake that can be tolerated, this is slightly less than 1/3, because not all parties necessarily participate, rather a large enough random sample. So Vincent will talk a bit more about this later. So how does Tenderbake work? I'll first focus on the single shot algorithm, which provides agreement on a single value, usually a block, and then on the multi-shot algorithm, which provides agreement on a sequence of values, that is, on the whole blockchain. A consensus instance is run by a fixed set of parties called validators. The algorithm executes in rounds, where each round represents an attempt to reach consensus. If a validator does not see evidence that the consensus is reached, it goes to the next round. Each round has a leader, also called the proposer, whose task is to propose the value to be agreed upon during this round. It is important that eventually there is a round with an honest proposer, and the simple way to achieve this is to rotate the proposers. Now each round has three phases: the proposal phase, in which the proposer broadcasts its proposed value, and two voting phases, in which the validators vote on the proposed value by signing it. We call these votes pre-endorsements and respectively endorsements. The pre-endorse phase can be seen as a preliminary voting phase. By pre-endorsing a value, a validator basically says, I plan to endorse this value. Now, a validator only endorses the proposed value if it has seen a quorum of pre-endorsements for this value. That is, it has seen at least 2/3 of all pre-endorsements. We call such a set of pre-endorsements a PQC, a pre-endorsement quorum certificate. By endorsing a value only if this value has a PQC, a validator is confident it votes for a value that has a chance to be agreed upon, because the majority of honest validators also plan to endorse it. Finally, if a validator has observed a quorum of endorsements, an EQC, then it decides, that is, it considers that the proposed value has been agreed upon, so it can terminate the single shot algorithm. If a validator has not observed such a quorum, then it simply goes to the next round. So now that I have described the steps each validator performs, we can take a look at the best case execution and how this would look like for all validators. In such a best case execution, every honest validator decides in one round. So again, what happens is a value V is proposed by an honest validator. This proposed value is received by all validators. Then all validators pre-endorse it. Then all validators received the sent pre-endorsements and endorse the value. Then finally, all validators see all the sent endorsements and decide on that value. Note that this best case execution makes a number of assumptions. First, that the proposer is honest, and as we have already mentioned, this assumption eventually holds in some round because proposers are selected in a round-robin fashion. The other main assumption is that all validators are synchronized on the round, that is, they are in the same round for sufficiently long. Furthermore, all messages sent in a round arrive while everyone is still in the same round. So how do we ensure that this assumption is eventually satisfied? Our approach is to use real-time clocks and to make the mild assumption that these clocks are eventually loosely synchronized, meaning that they can drift from one another, but the drifts cannot increase too fast. I note here that this is one of the main differences with Tendermint. Tendermint does not make this assumption. However, making this mild and realistic assumption has several benefits. First, fewer messages are sent because there is no need to send messages to synchronize on the round. Next, we can separate the round synchronization mechanism from the main algorithm, and this leads to a slightly simpler algorithm and to cleaner proofs. And finally, it is sufficient to only consider messages from the current round, which means that message bouncers cannot grow unboundedly. So now we can use this assumption on validator clocks to ensure that validators are synchronized in the round, simply by fixing the round durations. More exactly, rounds have predetermined durations. For instance, round 0 takes 30 seconds, round 1 60 seconds, and so on. It only remains to ensure that all validators start their consensus instance at the same time. And as we'll see later, this is easy to do. Finally, by picking round durations that are increasing and divergent, we ensure that eventually there will be a round during which all messages sent in that round are received within that round. So what we have seen is that eventually the best execution scenario will occur, and this ensures that the progress property holds. Eventually, validators will decide on a value. However, it remains to ensure that up to that point, nothing bad can occur. That is, validators will not take different decisions. To prevent this, the algorithm is actually more involved than I have initially presented. Namely, there is a so-called locking mechanism, which says that a validator has endorsed the value at a given round. So a validator that has endorsed the value at a given round locks on that value and that round. So what that means is that when it's its turn to propose, it cannot propose any value. It has to propose the value it has locked on. So here's an example. At round 0, validator A proposes some value V0. Say that validator B does not observe a pre-endorsement quorum. However, C does observe one, and therefore C endorses and locks on V0 at round 0. At round 1, say it's B's turn to propose. B is not locked, so it can propose any value, say V1. At round 2, say it's C's turn to propose. But as C is locked, it must propose its locked value V0 and not a new value. So the takeaway here is that the proposer at the current round may be different from the one that initially proposed the currently proposed value. Such scenarios should rarely happen, however, because we expect that decisions are already taken at round 0 when nobody is locked. But in general, it may be the case. So this aspect will be important later on when Vincent will talk about the incentives mechanism used in Tenderbake. The locking mechanism has a few other rules, but I refer you to the paper for the full set of rules. Now that we have seen the single shot case, we can go on to the multi-shot case, which ensures that parties agree on a sequence of values. And here I'll make the connection with blockchains and with Tezos in particular more explicit. Conceptually, the multi-shot case is very simple. Simply execute sequentially the single shot instances. Each instance is executed by a potentially different set of validators. These are selected at random based on their stake from the whole pool of participants with a minimal stake, that is, from the set of active delegates in Tezos terminology. So here we actually use exactly the same mechanism as for endorser selection in Emmy. Now let's fix the other abstract notions that we have used before. A proposal message is simply a block, which contains a header, itself containing a hash to the predecessor block and other fields, and operations. And we have non-consensus operations, mainly transactions, and consensus operations, mainly endorsements, which are for the previous block. The predecessor hash and the non-consensus operations represent the value that the validators agree upon while running the single-shot consensus instance. We call this value the block's payload. As I have mentioned, the block proposer is usually the same as the payload proposer, but they may differ in general. Now, the included endorsements for a previous block should represent a quorum certificate, certifying that agreement has been already reached at the previous level. This means that we have deterministic payload finality after one confirmation. And because the payload includes the predecessor hash, we have deterministic block finality after two confirmations. Finally, pre-endorsements and endorsements are operations, and their content is as expected. Before concluding, let me go back to the assumption we have made for single-shot consensus, that validators start their consensus instance at the same time. In the multi-shot case, the starting time of an instance is normally the ending time of a previous instance. But the ending time needs not be the same for all validators. Some validators may observe an endorsement quorum at a round, and some others may only observe it at a later round. The solution to this issue is for validators to notice the smallest round at which a decision has been made at the previous level, and consider that the previous instance ended at that round, even if for them it actually ended at a later round. In this way, eventually everybody agrees on the starting time of the current instance. So how is this achieved in practice? It's by allowing two-level reorganizations. So let's look at an example to see how this works. For each block at levels L-1 and L, the figure shows the round at which the block was proposed, the transaction it contains, and the hash of the previous block. Consider validator P that has decided at level L-1 for the block proposal B prime, based on an endorsement quorum certificate for round 3. However, there is also an endorsement quorum certificate for round 2 on block proposal B second. It is just that this validator has not observed it. But say another validator Q has observed it. So now both P and Q are at level L, but in some sense they run into disjoint consensus instances because they have different views of the predecessor block. So they cannot agree on the payload. However, eventually P will see a proposal from Q's consensus instance. And at that point, P will switch to Q's branch because Q's branch is better. The round at level L-1 on Q's branch is 2, which is smaller than the round at level L-1 on P's branch, which is 3. And in this way, P will synchronize with Q. I note, however, that such rewards should rarely happen. Normally, every validator should end its instance at round 0. To wrap up, Tenderbake is a classic style algorithm, tolerating Byzantine faults over an asynchronous network, and it has the following notable features. Committees change from level to level. Clocks are supposed to be eventually loosely synchronized. Message buffers are guaranteed to be bounded, and the consensus logic is separated from the round synchronization mechanism. Furthermore, there is a difference between payload and block producers, and finality comes after 1 or 2 confirmations, depending on whether we consider a block's payload or the whole block. These two last aspects are mainly driven by constraints imposed by the Tezos architecture. I'll end this part by acknowledging related formalization and verification efforts. Note, Sylvain Conchon and the Functori team provided the first TLA plus formalization of Tenderbake with a focus on safety in a work that has been presented as the formal methods for blockchains workshop. Then Mark Karpov from Twig has written a general purpose simulation framework for blockchain consensus algorithms, and also a testing framework for the Baker daemon. Finally, another complementary testing framework for the Baker daemon is being developed by Functori. And with this, I end my part. Thank you for your attention.
Hello everyone, my name is Vincent. I'm an R&D architect at Nomadic Labs, and I've been working on Tenderbake for the past 6 months. Today I'm going to give you a practical overview of the integration of Tenderbake in Tezos and the most significant changes that you will find in the Tenderbake proposition. So first thing first are the security deposits that we completely reworked. So in Emmy, whenever you were producing a block or an endorsement, we required you to deposit some tokens to act as a guarantee that you will not cheat the consensus. And if you actually were cheating the consensus, then all the deposits that were accumulated over a 5-cycle window would be forfeited. And you would lose basically every token that you were putting as a guarantee. These deposits were actually computed to match approximately 10% of the stake. And this posed some problems, in particular whenever you were over-delegated, so when you had more delegation that you were not able to pay with a deposit, means that you would miss some slots, so you will not be able to produce block because you could not pay the deposit, and therefore it was slowing the chain, and you could not endorse, so it was quite bad for the liveness. And there was also the problem that each time we were applying an endorsement or a block, we needed to register this deposit, and this made the block validation quite slow. So you needed to do this I/O to register the deposit, and that slowed the process. In Tenderbake, we decided to change this mechanism to actually provide this security deposit in an upfront way. And so we now require delegates to pay this security deposit that was corresponding to 10% of their stake. We define stake as being the own balance of the delegate plus the sum of all the delegation he has. And if you are caught cheating the consensus in Tenderbake, we will forfeit part of this deposit. So for double baking, if you were caught producing 2 blocks for the same level and the same round, you will lose 640 tokens. If you double endorse, then you will lose 50% of the total deposits. So this this disparity is explained because double baking is not as harmful as in Emmy. In Tenderbake, it's considered as spam, so it's bad for the network, but it's not dramatic. While double endorsing is actually very harmful and should not happen at all. So if you are caught double endorsing, you will lose half of your security deposits. As in Emmy, the delegate has to pay for the deposit from its own balance. It cannot be the delegators. And if the delegate is not able to pay up his deposit, then he will have less baking rights, and this means less effective stake, what we call the effective stake. So to illustrate this mechanism a bit, I'm going to take a few scenarios. So the first one is a delegate without any delegation. So he has 10,000 tokens and no delegation. In this situation, the stake will be his own balance. So the stake we will consider to draw the baking rights and all will be 10,000, and the deposit will be only 1,000. Okay, so we freeze 10% of its stake as a deposit. He cannot act onto it, but he can still use his 9,000 remaining tokens to spend as he wants. In the case of a delegate that's, for example, running a delegation service that has 10,000 tokens and it has 80,000 tokens as delegations, his total stake will then be the sum of both of these values, which will be 19,000 tokens. And this means that we require the delegates to deposit 10% of this sum, which will result in 10,000 tokens. And he will only retain 1,000 as spendable tokens. So the last scenario is a delegate that is actually over-delegated, so meaning that he has only 10,000 tokens, but he has way more tokens as delegation, way more that he can pay up for. So what we do in this situation is that we will cap its stake to the maximum deposit he's able to produce. So we take the maximum deposit he's able to produce, which is 10,000 tokens, his own balance, and we multiply this by 10 so that the total stake is represent 10 times the deposit. So the deposit is 10% of the stake. In this situation, it doesn't have any spendable tokens anymore. This way, there is no possibility to be over-delegated or have more rights that you can actually handle. Okay, so this security deposit can be managed. By default, the deposits are managed automatically. They are managed to maximize the what we call the active stake, so the effective stake. In this situation, the active stake is 100,000. But it's possible to determine a limit, an upper limit to it. So in Tenderbake, we had a new operation, which is set deposit limit. And this operation can be called by any wallet if it implements this feature. And this way, the delegate is able to manage his limit. And this is particularly useful when you want to retain a certain amount of spendable tokens, if you want to be sure that you have enough tokens to pay for NFTs or whatever you want to buy. And this is also useful when you want to exit the network, to stop being a validator and retrieve your deposits. And so, for example, you will call this operation and set the limit to 0. And this way, you won't be selected to produce any blocks, and thus you won't need to make a deposit. So this is how you manage the security deposits manually. And so how do we determine the stake formula? So how do we decide how much stake a delegate has? So this is quite simple. The stake is determined by selecting the minimum value between the staking balance, which is the delegate's own balance plus the sum of all the delegation he has, and the minimum between the staking balance and 10 times the deposit cap. So the deposit cap is the amount of tokens he is able to pay up as deposits. So if the delegate has set a limit, it has not set a limit, then we directly take his own balance. We take this full balance as a deposit. Otherwise, if he has set a limit, then we take the minimum value between the deposit limit he put up and his own balance. So that's quite simple. And this way, we are sure that you don't have more rights that than you are able to be slashed for, to be punished for. All right. So when are these security deposits frozen? So the security deposits are frozen at the end of a cycle, precisely when the rights for new cycles are being drawn. So each time you decide the rights for a new cycle, you will also be given a deposit that you need to pay for. And for each of the cycles in the chain, we will determine a specific deposit, but we don't freeze every deposit for each cycle. We only freeze one deposit. And so, which one do we take? Well, actually, we take the highest deposit in a time frame. So let's suppose we are at this current level in the cycle C. In this situation, the cheating opportunities that we are for the previous cycles in the past. So for the past cycles, we are able to cheat. We are able to double sign the block or double sign an endorsement. And so we need to make sure that we have something to pay up for, so the deposits. But we will also in the future have future cheating opportunities. And so we need to make sure that in all this time frame, we retain the maximum value that we want to act as deposits. So we want to ensure that the delegates are always able to pay for the potential cheating opportunities or past cheating opportunities that they have, so that they can be punished for the punished proportionally to the capacity they have to arm the network. So during a time frame of 7 cycles, we will keep only the highest deposits that were acted on one of this cycle. All right. When do you retrieve your deposit? So delegates will have its stake fluctuates in time. Whenever they receive a new delegation, his stake will rise, and so we will require a new deposit to be made, a higher deposit. And as the opposite, if he loses some stake, if he sells some tokens or delegation stop delegating to him, he will have a lower stake, and then we will need to reduce the deposit because the stake will be lowered. And so it will be reduced, but over time, when we are sure that the delegate is actually not capable of cheating anymore using the rights he was assigned to. For instance, whenever a delegate gets inactive, so an inactive delegate is a validator that did not produce any blocks or endorsements in the past 5 cycles, he will be considered inactive, and he will retrieve its deposit, but only after a long period of time, which is 12 cycles. But this is actually not the way to go. In Tenderbake, we want validators to be active, even if they want to exit the network. And the proper way to go is to actually set your deposit limit to 0 tokens. And this way you will first recover your entire deposit in way less time, which is 7 cycles. And you will be stopped being chosen as validators. So that's the proper way to exit the network as a validator. All right, so the next part is about the stake distribution. So we made a significant number of changes, and the most significant for this is the endorsing slot. The number of endorsing slots rise up from a lot from Emmy star. So in Emmy star we had 256 endorsing slots, while in Tenderbake we have more than 7,000. And so the reason for that is that compared to Tendermint, we don't have a fixed committee for an extended period of time, but for each level, we select randomly a new committee. And if we suppose that at most 1/3 of the slots are controlled by the Byzantine bikers, then it becomes necessary to reduce the variance that the random decision of the committee was based upon to. So this means that the greater the number of slots we have, the less chance we will have that 1/3 of the slots are controlled by Byzantine bakers. And so we determine this value because this is the number that ensures that an attacker will not control more than 1/3 of the slots every once in a century. So this basically means that you cannot you cannot have an opportunity. Well, you won't have a huge opportunity to produce an attack. All right, so 7,000 is a huge number, and this has as a side effect that delegates will now participate way more often. In particular, they will participate at least every 10 blocks. So if you have the minimum required number of amount of stake to participate in the network, you will, in average, endorse a block every 10 blocks. So this is a bit scary, but it's actually okay because you don't produce 7,000 endorsements operation. You won't spam the network with 7,000 endorsements because endorsements operation act for multiple slots. So let's say I'm a big baker and I have, I don't know, 100 slots attributed to me. If I produce one endorsement, this one endorsement will act for the 100 slots that I was selected for, and therefore the number of endorsement operations that are in the network will be proportional to the number of validators, which is way less than 7,000. Right now, in Emmy, there is what we call the role-based model. So a role-based model attributed to each validator a specific amount of roles. So a role is currently 8,000 tokens, and baking and endorsing rights were based on the number of roles you possessed. But this data structure was not efficient enough for the number of slots that we wanted to consider, and so we completely replaced it with a better and more efficient data structure, which we call that stake-based model. And that means that for each validators, we associate a specific amount of stake directly instead of an approximation based on the number of roles. So this comes up with an update of the storage with significant upgraded representation, which is able to actually handle this number of slots. And this has also as a side effect that we are now able to confidently lower the entry cost. And now we are moving from 8,000 to 6,000. So this is something that has been asked from the community for a while now. We were not confident enough before that because the role-based model was too complex to handle this change. However, we still have other concerns, for example, the number of endorsements operation that depends on the number of validators. So if a lot of validators are in the network, we might have too much operation to handle. 6,000 is something that we made sure that we could sustain. And this is the first step before lowering it even more. But right now, we are still being conservative about it. And we'll continue to run our benchmarks and experiments to make sure that everything goes well. But if that's the case, then 6,000 will be the new entry cost to join the network as a validator. Okay, next up is the rework of the rewards system. So Tenderbake has needed us to rework the reward system, and we actually refreshed it a bit. So now the instant reward. Each time you produce a block or are rewarded for endorsements, you will receive the rewards instantly. It means that you won't need to we won't need to freeze them for 5 cycles because of the new security deposit scheme. So actually, this freezing of 5 cycles was due because we wanted to make sure that you could not cheat during this period. But now that we have the security deposit mechanism, we are able to rely on that to make sure you don't cheat. And this way, we are able to instantly give the rewards. So each time you bake a block, you will have a reward directly in your account. All right. For the endorsing rewards, it's quite different from Emmy. So in Emmy, as a reminder, you only receive endorsing rewards whenever your endorsement was included in the block. In Tenderbake, it's quite different because all the endorsing rewards are distributed at the end of a cycle. So whenever we reach the end of a cycle, we will give the full endorsing rewards for the cycles, and on the only condition that the validators participate enough in the cycle. Participate enough means that at least 50% of the slots he was attributed to was you produced an endorsement of 50% of the slots you were given in this cycle. Also, now we reduced also the variance on the rewards and on the endorsing rewards. So the formula is as follows. So for Delegate D, its endorsing rewards at the end of a cycle will be the stake of this delegate, and we divide it by the total stake in the network. We multiply by the number of blocks in a cycle, and we multiply by the number of tokens we attribute to the endorsing rewards per block. This is exactly the same number of tokens that are created, so there is no inflation with these new rewards. But there is a good side effect. It's that there is absolutely no variance, so you will be rewarded regarding your stake on the basis that you participated enough in the cycle. And so yeah, there won't be problems on endorsement loss anymore, and so that's quite a good rework in my opinion. In Tenderbake, we also reworked the baking rewards, and as Eugen explained it to you, we distinguish two different roles when baking a block. The first role is the payload producer. So this is the validator that is responsible of filtering the operation, applying the operation, validating the operation, and basically determining which operation will go in the block or not. But in some case, whenever the consensus was not fully reached, we would repropose the same block, but this time by a different baker, and this one we will call the block producer. So he did not choose the operation, but he reproposed the block to the vote phase to be accepted on this round. And under normal circumstances, the payload producer is actually the block producer, so it doesn't change anything. But in some case, when the consensus is slow to be reached, then we make this distinction. And this distinction is important for the baking rewards because we partition the rewards in 3 categories. So the first category is the operation fees. The operation fees always go to the payload producer. He is the one responsible for selecting the operations. So he gets the fees and he gets the fees of the operations. He actually did his job. So he did his job, so he is rewarded with 10 tokens. This goes to the payload producer as well. And the reward that goes to the block producer is the number of endorsements that he included in the block. And the more endorsements the block producer includes in the block, the bigger the rewards. And so this gives an incentive to include as much endorsement as we want. So we ensure that the participation of endorser is preserved. Again, the 20 tokens that we see here are the same as in Emmy, so the inflation remains the same. I'm now entering the last part of the presentation, which is the breaking change, the changes that we needed to do, and that's potentially breaking some third-party applications. So the first breaking change is that the baker needed to be fully reworked so that he could implement the Tenderbake algorithm. And in particular, the baker is also now the endorser. So you don't need to start the endorser anymore, only the baker. And as always, as a reminder, never run two bakers at the same time, because you will be able to double sign an endorsement or a block, and which will be quite bad. Another reminder is the finality. So the finality, the deterministic finality comes at a cost. You cannot ensure liveness if you have deterministic finality. That's a theoretical result. And so that means that the chain can halt, but it cannot halt if at least 2/3 of the validators are active and are doing their part as they should. But the chain may halt in some situation, and this is an expected side effect. We cannot do anything against that, especially if we expect deterministic finality. In a normal situation, it cannot arise. It won't arise, but if delegates remain active, of course. Another significant change is the endorsement operation refactor. We needed to include more operation to include more information in the endorsement operation, and for that, and this has as a side effect that it can break some signers. In particular, when we are checking for the double signing detection in the signers, for example, in the ledger baking app, there is a security protection that's ensuring that you don't double sign or don't double sign endorsement or blocks. So as a side effect, this will break the double signing detection that you can find in the signers. So in the signers, there is this protection that ensures that you cannot double sign the block or endorsement at the same level. And it's actually not the case anymore with Tenderbake, because you can and actually must endorse and bake at the same level. But the only difference is that you will bake and endorse at a higher round. Okay, there is this notion of round in Tenderbake that we will also see in the endorsement. And so this double signing detection must be up to date, and therefore we need to update the signers, in particular the signer applications. All right, so that concludes the presentation. So you can find more in-depth information on this link. So a small point on the current implementation. We are closing in on the implementation, so we are hoping to merge it into master by the end of October. You can find also more information in the blog post that we did a while ago. There is also the tzip proposition that you can take a look at. It will most likely be updated as we go, but it covers the point I've made in this presentation. You can also find the report paper that was submitted some months ago. And lastly, we hope to launch the testnet by the end of October. So whenever the current implementation is merged into master. And we hope that you can participate and help us make sure that everything goes well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vincent and Eugen, for the presentation. So now let's have a look at our question in chat. So as a first question, we have how will Tenderbake affect baking rewards? So you said something about that during your talk. Do you want to add something?
No, I think I was pretty clear. If you need some more details, I can ask that.
Okay. So next one. What will happen to network performance on the node side?
We benched so that the performance was stable. Okay, so basically that's why we did the stake model. So we still need to make sure that with the current mainnet context and all, everything goes smooth. So this is something we need to do from time to time, because the more the chain grows, the more it can be stressful for the network. But what we did confirmed that it was quite all right, as we did a significant number of improvements in the Tenderbake.
Okay. So will Tenderbake affect decentralization in terms of node selection?
So if the minimal token amount for becoming a validator is indeed decreased to 6,000 tokens, then I think decentralization will be even greater. And also, I'd like to mention that at each level, many more delegates will participate in the consensus because we increase the number of slots. So actually, almost a big percentage of delegates will have to participate. So that I think increases this decentralization.
Okay, thank you, Eugen. Will there be public Tenderbake testnet launch on the testnet?
So yeah, as I said in the conclusion, we hope to start it by the end of the month, if everything goes well, and the more people that are willing to join and help us test, the better. So
So there is another question about that. So what should testnet participants pay attention to when using Tenderbake testnet?
So we will mainly do the monitoring, so through block explorers and our development monitoring, basically. But you should check that your node is running, the baker is running, there is no performance issue regarding high memory consumption, things like that. So nothing too intricate to the model, but just check that everything goes well with your deployment, basically. That will be really helpful.
Okay, thank you, Vincent. And can you tell us more about the migration event from Emmy to Tenderbake, and how does the network switch from one consensus scheme to another seamlessly?
All right, so that was quite tricky to actually do, because we do change quite a bit of stuff in Tenderbake, especially the security deposit parts. So basically what we do is that the previous deposits that were made by the Emmy consensus, we retain them and we convert them into the security deposits that I just presented. And also we need to actually rewrite the role model into the state model, which is something that's quite direct, but it's still something we need to test a lot. And after that, we have to put some let's say glue for the first cycles to handle the migration. After that, it will be seamless, but the migration in itself is indeed something quite tricky that we need to make sure that we do well, and we basically test it against mainnet context regularly to see if that's all right.
Okay, so there are other questions in chat, but some of them, maybe all of them, have been get an answer in the chat. So maybe I have another question. So if the finality is reached after 2 blocks in Tenderbake, how is it possible to cheat before these 2 blocks?
Right. So this is something that's quite intertwined in the protocol. We still need to consider a granularity in terms of cycle. This is something that's basically legacy that we hope to move from in the future. But at this point, after 2 blocks, it's considered as spam. But the node handled this such that it's potentially a reorg in the chain, and so we still need to make this security. This security to punish in the few cycle back that we at some point we will change from the legacy parts to a new better representation, and yeah, meanwhile we need to stick with the current limitation we have from the legacy code, but that's why.
Okay, so I would say again thanks Vincent and Eugen for sharing your knowledge about Tenderbake with us. So and thank you to the audience for attending this research seminar session. So our next seminar will be on the 19th of October. Okay, so stay tuned. Thank you very much.